Alright, so today we're going to talk about homeostasis, and in homeostasis we utilize a number of processes in the body to achieve balance in the body. Now, when we say homeostasis, what this basically means is a system of balance. Alright, cheesy drawing of the monkeys on the teeter-totter. But I think they raise an interesting point. Any one of us who have been on a seesaw, we can envision that even if this seesaw is completely balanced, that we're still making small, minute corrections in our orientation and our attitude in an effort to maintain the balance. So if this crazy monkey decides to take one of its hands off of the teeter-totter, that's going to shift his balance onto the other hand, and that's going to translate to a shift in how the weight is distributed along this end, which will have an effect on this guy, and then he's going to have to make some shifts in his positioning and attitude in order to maintain this balance. So any one of us who have ever been on a teeter-totter knows what this feels like when we're trying to keep that balanced and someone on the other end moves a little bit, shifts a little bit, because nothing stays constant or persistent. We're making tiny alterations all the time to maintain this balance. And we have a number of processes that are occurring at the same time that are all allowing us to maintain the balance. One is a negative feedback loop, semi-permeable membranes, the process of diffusion, concentration gradients, osmosis, and the processes of pressure within the body. All of these, and some others that I haven't even named today, are going to play a role in helping the body maintain balance or homeostasis, because the external parts of the world are constantly having an effect on our bodies, and then our own internal environment are also going to have an effect on our bodies. And so every time we shift off of normal, we have to basically do something to return us back to normal. And as long as the body is working well, that means that it's able to achieve homeostasis well. So we'll work through these different processes together, and then later we'll apply them as we talk about anatomy and physiology in different body systems. So most of us actually are familiar with our negative feedback loops, at least some of them. So let's give you an example of one that we're all pretty familiar with. So it's a very cold day out, and we'll say it's 32 degrees outside. So it's very, very cold. Here's our little snowflake. Alright, so we have a young man. We'll call him Nicholas. And Nicholas is insistent on not wearing a coat outside, despite his mother's insistence that he do so. Now, Nicholas may or may not be related to me. In any event, it's cold outside, and there is a very brisk wind blowing. And this cold air is going to make contact with his skin, where he has thermoreceptors. Now, some of these thermoreceptors are buried in a number of different places in the body. Nonetheless, what they do is what's tremendously important. So let's say this is Nicholas's brain, and here's his spinal cord. Alright, so here's his body around these structures. So we said that it's very cold out, there's a wind blowing, and that information gets transmitted from the thermoreceptors, some of which are buried in the blood vessels in the neck. And as that cold air comes in contact, it sends a message to the brain that it's cold. Now this section of the brain is the brainstem. And the brainstem is where a lot of our vegetable functions are. So this message gets sent to the brain, and the brain then will elicit a response that's in opposition to the cold air to try and bring the patient's body temperature back to normal. Now, what is normal for our patient? 98.6 is normal. But let's say that cold air, which we know is 32 degrees, it hits the neck and cools the body enough so that maybe between the cold air coming in contact, maybe the body shifts by tenths of a degree to 98.1. While the body wants to achieve homeostasis, the body wants to return itself back to normal. So how does it do this? We said that the information about the cold air went to the brain. Well, the brain is now going to generate a response and sending that information back down the spinal cord. The information will then leave the spinal cord and travel out to the body, and that message will be to shiver. Once that message hits the muscles, the patient's body will start to shiver. We all know what shivering's like. And shivering creates heat, because you're asking the muscles to work. So we had a patient who started out at 98.6, started to head downhill to, let's say, 98.1. That information got fed to the brain, and the brain's response was to initiate shivering. That shivering created body heat, and then that heat brought the patient back to the 98.6 again. So that's one example of a negative feedback loop, and I think most of us are pretty familiar with it. Hi folks, today we're going to talk a little bit about anatomy and physiology and the role that they play in achieving homeostasis. Now, if you did your reading, you'll know that our anatomy, our body parts, are comprised of much, much smaller pieces. And then how those body parts work is the term known as physiology. And based on the structures and how they work, hopefully, if everything is working well, they will achieve homeostasis. Homeostasis, a great word, and what it means is balance, aka balance. Now, our bodies are changing on the inside, and they're changing to reflect changes on the outside of our body as well. So whenever we have a change in the external environment, and that could be the weather changing, and it usually is the weather changing, or our internal environment, which could be our internal environment might change because we've been exposed to the flu bug and now we're generating a fever. Whenever we start to sway outside of balance, our body will start a system of checks and balances, if you will,
to try and get us back into balance again. So it's dynamic and ongoing and constant if our bodies are working well. So let's start with the different structures in the body. And the smallest structure that we're going to talk about is going to be the cell. All right? And cells are actually comprised of even smaller structures, which might be the portions on the inside of the cell. It might be the nucleus. It might be the mitochondria, which is basically the work engine of the cell. And it might be things like other organelles that perform different tasks in the body. So that's going to be the smallest structure that we're going to be talking about, is the cell. Now, when you have a group of cells, then we don't refer to them anymore as a group of cells. We now refer to them as tissue. So a group of cells is going to be tissue. And then tissues that work in tandem together, in cooperation together, and they're all related because they perform a similar function. These are two different types of tissues. That's going to be an organ. So, tissues working together to achieve a common goal is an organ. Tissues, common goal. It's going to be an organ. And then once we have organs that work together to sustain a body, and of course these are various organs, and they're all doing different work, let's say, in the body, and they're all comprised of tissues and cells and so forth. And once we get groups of organs together that are all working towards a common good, that is referred to as the organism. So when we think about our bodies, we know that we have tons of cells, tissues, organs, and all of them comprised together are going to equal the organism, or in our case, human beings. So the question is, what is it about our body that permits us to make fluctuations, to make changes, to accommodate changes outside of us, as well as to accommodate changes that various parts of our body are making? So for example, let's say you had an accident and you tripped and you fell on your pencil. And that's a bad day, right? You fell on your pencil and there's your pencil lead or your pencil eraser, and the pencil lead pierced into one of the tissues in your body. This tissue is probably going to get a little bit angry, a little bit swollen, particularly around the site. And now that change is going to affect the neighboring tissues. And so what changes are they going to make to accommodate the fact that there's a change in the body? And they will make changes. And all of our tissues are going to make changes as long as they're working well, okay? Because in sick people, this doesn't necessarily apply. In people that have been injured, this might not apply as well, because once you interrupt enough of any of these groups, then it's difficult for them to interact together well again. So rest assured, though, if we have something that interrupts a group, the other groups are going to try and acclimate. All right, so how does that occur? Well, we've got a number of structures in our body. Let's talk about the different tissues that are in the body. Let me pause this for a moment. All right, so we have our organism, And let's talk about some of the big structures that are going to play a role in directing how we react to changes in our environment. So one of the first ones that pops into mind is going to be our brain. So our brain is basically going to direct the body on how to respond. And the brain does the thinking, obviously. I think most of us know that. Except that when it does the thinking, it needs to get the message to the rest of the body, and it utilizes the spinal cord. And think of it as a subway system. So the message starts out, aha, in the brain, and then that message is going to be sent down the spinal cord until it reaches the junction where it can leave the spinal cord and then travel out to some other part of the body. So perhaps this brain decided that he wanted to do some sit-ups, and so the brain sent the direction down the spinal cord, and then from there it branched out into what are called peripheral nerves. And they're called peripheral because they're at the outside of the central nervous system. So they leave the central nervous system, and the central nervous system, we'll call it CNS, equals the brain and the spinal cord. But it does not equal the peripheral system. The peripheral nervous system, PNS, are all the nerves that then branch off of the central nervous system from the spinal cord. So that nervous impulse is going to get transferred along this pathway, along this nerve, and maybe it's going to go on both sides, and this guy, let's say this is about his stomach, now he's going to be able to do some crunches, let's say. So the central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord work together to have the idea or have the thought, send that message down the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system will pick up that nervous impulse and transfer it out to all the muscles and the nerves and the blood vessels in our periphery. All right, so if we know that those signals get transmitted, we use the example of purposeful movement, something you decided to do. All right, so when you decide to do something, there is a set of muscles that will respond to your decisions, and those muscles are skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles will respond to your command. So you know if you want to go get some ice cream out of the freezer, you'll get out of your gaming chair and you'll take a big break from Xbox or whatever, and you'll head out to the kitchen, you'll grab some ice cream, you'll scarf it down, and then you'll direct yourself to go back to your gaming chair and continue your game. All of that was your decision. So that is under what's called voluntary control, which means you get to decide when those muscles move. So your brain thinks of the idea says, hey, I think I want to go get some ice cream. It makes the message travel down the spinal cord, branches out to your hands to press down on the arms of the chair to push you out of the chair, to your legs to start walking down to the kitchen. Different parts of your brain are keeping track at the same time of your balance as you reach out and turn on the light switch. All those things are voluntary actions that you decide. But while all that is happening, there's a bunch of other work that's going on in your body that you don't think about and you don't have to decide. And that, the muscles that are in charge of that, is called smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is the muscle that is just on autopilot. It's doing its thing without permission from your conscious self, but rest assured, your brain is still directing. Your brain is directing both the movement of the skeletal muscle, and it also directs the smooth muscle. The brain is ultimately in charge. This skeletal muscle is you deciding, that conscious part of your brain, and the smooth muscle is being directed by other parts of the brain that are not under your control. They're automatic, if you will. So the smooth muscle that is being controlled automatically by your brain falls under a part of the brain that's called the autonomic nervous system. ANS, autonomic, not automatic, but you can autonomic. You can think automatic to help you remember. Autonomic nervous system. This nervous system is going to basically direct all those muscles that you don't control to do various tasks. However, the various tasks can be widely different if you think about it. If you want to, let's say you want to go swimming in a pool. Now, you're going to direct that skeletal muscle to go swimming in the pool. But while you're swimming, there's a number of structures that have to happen, or a number of structures that have to act differently in your body to allow you to swim. So as you're deciding, I'm walking over to the pool and I'm swimming, you're directing your skeletal muscles to get there. You jump in the pool, and as soon as your body starts moving, you've shifted the balance in your body, because you're not just walking along and increasing the workload of any part of your body, but when you start swimming, you're increasing the workload dramatically. You're asking your skeletal muscles to do something. They're doing it. And in the meantime, you need an increased oxygen supply to those muscles. And to get that means your heart's going to have to beat harder and faster. And you're going to have your lungs that are going to want to work more quickly to get more oxygen to the blood supply. So how is it that those organs are knowing to pick up the pace? The reason they're able to know this is because those organs, your heart and your lungs, are going to be under the control of the autonomic nervous system. So while you made a decision to go swimming in the pool, and your muscles are obeying your direction to dog paddle or whatever it is you do, at the same time, you've got other organs that are starting to shift and starting to act differently, and the brain is directing them to do so to accommodate this increase in activity that you've decided to do. So the two systems, the voluntary system, which is the skeletal system, and then the autonomic nervous system, which is also known as the involuntary system, nervous system, they're working together to allow your body to live and do activities and sleep and eat and eliminate your waste products and reproduce other human beings. And these two systems, the voluntary system, which is your skeletal muscle, and your involuntary system, your autonomic system, which controls smooth muscle, those two systems are working together and helping you to achieve homeostasis. All right, so we talked about the autonomic nervous system, and that is basically in charge of all your actions that are involuntary, that you don't decide. And then you have your voluntary system, or your skeletal system, and this is going to be under control, your conscious control. So the autonomic nervous system is involuntary. The voluntary system, the skeletal system, is under voluntary control. And what's interesting to know is all this muscle that is under your control is all skeletal muscle. And when we say skeletal muscle, we're talking about the muscle in your abdomen, in your back, in your thighs, and your calves. All that muscle that you can readily see when we look at a patient or when we look at ourselves. Your autonomic nervous system, that controls something else, and that controls your smooth muscle. So by controlling the smooth muscle, you control a number of different functions in the body subconsciously. The brain does it without your knowledge or permission, if you will. So smooth muscle is what is under the autonomic nervous system. Now, what is smooth muscle? Where do we find it? What kinds of tissues do we find smooth muscle in? Smooth muscle is primarily found in these tissues, lining our blood vessels. Your blood vessels, every inch of them, particularly your arteries and your veins, to a lesser degree your capillaries, but your blood vessels, will say veins and arteries, have muscle lining them. Arteries. I can't spell. They have muscle lining them. The muscle is going to control the diameter of the blood vessel. So if that's the exterior of your blood vessel, and this is the muscle that lines the inside of the blood vessel, depending on what the body is trying to achieve, you might end up with relaxation in that muscle, so you've got a nice big open blood vessel, or you might end up with a blood vessel that starts the same size, but because the smooth muscle contracts and squeezes, you end up with a smaller opening in that blood vessel. And there's a time and a place for having an increased diameter of a blood vessel or a decreased one. And that will be dependent on where we want the blood to go. So smooth muscle can be found in your blood vessels, and we'll talk about this concept of where the blood goes shortly, not much longer from now. All right, so you've got blood vessels that have smooth muscle in them. Then you have aspects of your gastrointestinal system, we'll say the GI system, and your genitourinary system, which is your ability to eliminate your waste products through the urinary system, as well as your gastrointestinal system also allows you to eliminate waste through the colon. Your GI and GU systems, all that system has smooth muscle in it as well. So when you swallow food and the food travels through your esophagus, what else is making it move aside from gravity? It's a soft, squishy tube. If you were to take a section of, let's say, someone's tights, and you were to cut off the one leg of the tights and cut off both ends, so there's an opening at each end, and then you were to take something soft and squishy and shove it partway down that section, that leg section of a young woman's tights, that soft, squishy thing, that sock, let's say, that you put in the tights wouldn't really go anywhere. Gravity would be trying to do its thing, but because both pieces are soft and squishy, it really wouldn't permit much movement. So how is it that soft, squishy food gets propelled through our esophagus, which is also soft and squishy? Well, it's the smooth muscle inside the esophagus that squeezes and squeezes, almost like a tube of toothpaste, to push that food all the way down. So you've got smooth muscle in your esophagus, you've got smooth muscle in your stomach, and you've got smooth muscle all through your intestines, as well as through your urinary tract. And that smooth muscle is also controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Then you have smooth muscle that's wrapped around your bronchioles. Now your bronchioles are going to be those tubes. This is your lung, and the bronchioles are going to be those structures that branch off of the trachea and become smaller and smaller, and they're all tubes all the way down until they reach the structures called the alveoli, which are like little grape clusters scattered all over your lungs. And those bronchioles are also they also have a circumference to them, much like your blood vessel does. And they also have a lining to them. That is also muscle. I just made a goof there. All right, and so that lining, that is also smooth muscle that will sometimes squeeze shut like this, but oftentimes it'll remain nice and flexible and open so that you've got a nice big opening all the way down through those tubes so air can travel all the way to the bottom. So there's smooth muscle at the bronchioles as well. So opening and closing these tubes, the blood vessels, the tubes that are comprise our gastrointestinal and genitourinary systems, these tubes that have smooth muscle in them that are branching their way down to the bottoms of our lungs to deliver air all the way down to the bottom. What would make them either close up or open up? So what directs them to do that? Well, the autonomic nervous system is broken down into two sections. And the two sections are going to decide which of these tubes get opened and which of them get closed, and we can explain why. So your autonomic nervous system has two parts to it. The sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Hope I don't run out of room. The sympathetic is also called the fight or flight side of the nervous system. And then the parasympathetic is also called the feed and breed. And those two phrases, fight and flight or feed and breed, will actually give you an idea of what is taking place when one of these sides of the autonomic nervous system is dominant. So if the sympathetic side of the nervous system is dominant, that means that you're in the fight or flight response. And this usually means that you're either actually in physical danger or you think you are. So you can have an idea, oh no, I'm in danger, or something bad is about to happen, and it will trigger this side. Now, if you are resting, relaxing, starting to eat, or starting to engage in sexual relations for procreation, because that's how the body reads it, that is always meant for procreation, then you will be in the feed and breed side. Okay, so the question is, what's happening in the body depending on which side of these two systems that fall under the autonomic nervous system? What's happening in the body when each of these sides is dominant? So let's talk about that. So when we talk about these two nervous systems that fall under the autonomic nervous system, the fight or flight, the feed or breed, if you're fighting for your life or you're fleeing for your life, the question becomes, where do you need your blood supply? And the reason that question is important is because, remember, we determined that there is smooth muscle in our blood vessels, and basically if we open up a blood vessel in one part of the body and close it down in another part of the body, we're going to decrease the blood supply to the part that's closed down, and we're going to increase the blood supply to the part of the body whose blood vessels have been opened up. Now, when we talk about opening a blood vessel or closing a blood vessel, the proper words for an open blood vessel or a relaxed blood vessel is vaso, meaning vessel, and dilation means to open, and constriction, which of course means to close. So, or tighten would be another word. So when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system and which of these two sides we're in, what's basically going to happen for the most part is each of these sides is going to direct blood flow to one part of the body and away from another part of the body. And that's going to be decided based on which side you fall in. So if you're sitting there following Thanksgiving dinner and you're full, your stomach's full, you put on the football game, your body, based on the fact that you just ate food and that your stomach is full, is going to click into the feed or breathe side on its own. All right? But let's say you're sitting there and you're watching a football game and your stomach is full of food, and suddenly, out of nowhere, a tree branch falls into your house. Now, it doesn't hurt you, but you hear the sound of a tree branch crashing into your house, and guess what? You're going to immediately click over into the fight or flight response. So, while you're digesting your food, you're going to have an increased blood supply in the GI system, but then when you suddenly feel frightened that something bad has just happened, the blood supply is going to switch over to where you would need it most if you needed to fight something dangerous or run from something dangerous. Now keep in mind, when your brain gets a message that something is wrong because you heard something, or you saw something, or you thought of something that alarmed you, all your brain knows is you have perceived that something bad has happened or you're in danger of some kind, any kind of danger. You could have this response just from realizing that you forgot to mail in your car payment on time and you're going to end up getting a $50 late fee. You have that thought pop into your head and you're going to click into the fight or flight side of the autonomic nervous system. So once you have either the thought or experience that makes you feel like you're in danger, or you tend to relax, rest, primarily eat something, those are going to be the things that tend to trigger you to more one side or more the other side. Now keep in mind, most of the time this is where we live. This is what's going on most of the time. This side just gets triggered in those moments where we think of something alarming or threatening in some way, or we see or hear or feel something that is threatening in some way. So most of the time when we're in the feed or breathe side, you're going to have an increased blood supply or blood flow to all the organs that you need to basically be in this frame of reference, in this physiological response. Increased blood flow. So that's going to be to your GI system, your GU system, because let's face it, even if you ate 2 hours ago, your GI system and your GU system are still working on getting the nutrients out of the food and forming waste products so that you can go to the bathroom and eliminate your waste products. So this process is pretty much ongoing. Even if it's been a number of hours after you've eaten, this is still happening. So you'll need an increased blood supply to the GI system, the GU system, and that includes your organs of reproduction, because let's face it, human beings are able to reproduce at will. We don't go into season once or twice a year like deer do or other mammals. So we're able to go into reproductive state at will. So our blood supply is going to be increased there as well. And it's also going to be present and increased in our skin. And so that's why our skin is warm and dry most of the time, because we've got a nice constant blood supply to the skin. Now, we always have a constant blood supply throughout the body as long as we're not injured or ill. But the question is, where does most of it go? Because the body is always trying to keep a reserve somewhere. So it will take from one area, or at least reduce the amount of blood flow to one area so it can give a greater share to another area. And in the feeder breed or parasympathetic side, the body is increasing blood flow to these parts of the body, these organ systems. And the question is, well, where is it taking it from? Well, if you need an increased blood flow to your GI system, your GU system, your reproductive organs, your skin, you probably don't need that much to your skeletal muscle. So you tend to have a reduction in blood supply to skeletal muscle. You don't really need it there. And you have a little bit of a reduction to the heart and to the lungs. Because again, the body's efficient enough that it can make do with a lesser supply in these organs and sustain you just fine in these low metabolic, low energy kinds of activities. All right, so you're going to get an increased blood flow to your GI, GU, reproductive system, skin, and a decreased blood supply to the skeletal muscle, heart, and lungs when you're in the parasympathetic side. Now, what about when you're in the sympathetic side? Now you need to be able to run, you need to be able to fight, you need to be able to flee. So what organs are going to need the bigger blood supply? Well, your skeletal muscle is going to need an increased blood flow increase in blood flow to skeletal muscle, because you definitely are going to need that if you actually need to fight or flee. And if you need to fight or flee and you need to use those skeletal muscles, we all know what happens when we start using our skeletal muscle a lot. We start to breathe faster and harder, and our heart starts to beat faster and harder. So you're going to need an increased blood flow to your heart, and you're also going to need an increased blood flow to your lungs. We'll say these are little lungs here. They're sad little lungs, but you'll get the idea. So we need increased blood flow to the heart and the lungs. So the question is, where don't we need it? Well, if you're running for your life, your body can put on hold blood supply to the GI system and the GU system. It can temporarily interrupt digestion to take the blood supply from here and give it over to the heart and lungs. And truth be told, you're probably not going to think about reproducing if you're fighting for your life. So it's going to reduce the blood supply to the organs of reproduction. We'll say repro. And guess where else? You really don't need a great blood supply to your skin to fight for your life. So you're going to have a reduced blood supply to your skin as well. So people that are in the parasympathetic side of the nervous system, they tend to have warm and dry skin. People in this sympathetic side tend to have pale, cool, and moist skin, because the blood supply is being taken from the skin and given to the skeletal muscle, taken from the skin and fed to the lungs and the heart, taken from the GI system and given to the skeletal muscle, heart, and lungs. So this is why our mothers tell us not to go swimming after we've just had a meal, because what may happen is when you have a stomach full of food, the sympathetic nervous system is not dominant, the parasympathetic is dominant. So the blood supply goes to the GI system and the GU system so you can start breaking down that food. But if you decide to go swimming while your body's in the middle of that, it's going to switch the blood flow away from the stomach and over to the skeletal muscle, the heart and the lungs. That is going to sit there. It's not going to get digested as quickly, and sometimes you'll end up with a stomach ache, and that's just because the food is sitting there and not moving forward as quickly. Now, if you're running for your life, you probably don't care if you have a stomach ache. You probably won't even notice it. This is something that you can tolerate while you're running for your life. However, if you're not running for your life and you don't need to, listen to your mother, sit down and let your stomach start digesting the food. And that is how the two systems are working and taking turns on an as-needed basis and switching the blood supply. So how is the blood supply being turned off and on? It's simply a matter of directing the vessels to either squeeze down, vasoconstrict, or open up, vasodilate. So we will move on to how that occurs in a moment. So we've got the sympathetic and we have the parasympathetic nervous system. And we know that we have sympathetic. We have a change in blood flow depending on which side we're in. So, just to repeat, on the sympathetic side, you've got an increase to the heart, to the lungs, and to the skeletal muscle. That's supposed to be a bicep. That's pretty sad. All right. But then we have a decrease to the GI system, the GU system, and to the skin, because we don't need it in those places. And on the parasympathetic side, it's the exact opposite, an increase to GI and GU and skin, and a decrease to the heart, the lungs, and the skeletal muscle. Man, is that sad. All right, so, and how does this occur? This occurs because the blood vessel size gets altered. So you've got that smooth muscle. Here's your blood vessel. And lining the inside of the blood vessel is going to be smooth muscle. And if you want to increase the blood supply to the lungs, to the heart, and to skeletal muscle, the blood vessels will be large and open to those structures. And at the same time, you have a blood vessel that also has smooth muscle on the inside. And because the blood supply is not here, needed here, the smooth muscle is going to clamp down and it's going to reduce the size of the blood vessel so that you get a decrease to the GI system, the GU system, and the skin. So you're basically robbing Peter to pay Paul. You're cutting down the supply to these systems and feeding it to this system by opening up the size of the vessel here and closing the vessel down on this side. And that happens in reverse on the parasympathetic side. You end up having the larger blood vessel on the parasympathetic side is then going to be in the GI and GU and so forth, and the skin. And then the smaller will be the heart, the lungs, and etc. So that's basically it in a nutshell. It's blood supply. It's the body or the brain directing blood supply by directing smooth muscle to either constrict or to dilate. And you'll see constriction and dilation in other structures in the body aside from the smooth muscle in the blood vessels, but we will save that for another time. Thanks for listening.